Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Chard, and I am the Dean of the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development here at Boston University and a professor in special education. It's really an honor for me to have the opportunity to host this afternoon's closing panel, which is a listening session with education leaders and follows on this morning's wonderful keynote and breakout sessions. I was able to attend the keynote session focused on teachers and loved the way in which the moderator and the panelists sort of dug deep into some of the emerging insights we are finding as we move through this pandemic. Now it's time for us to really sort of broaden the conversation. We'll use this opportunity to touch on aspects of what has been happening at the sort of the molecular level, but also talk about it on a bigger frame. And the goal of this session is really to take this step back and look ahead collectively to try and imagine what's ahead of us. So if we could move to the next slide. This is really the driving question of today's webinars, but also of this panel itself, and particularly what we should be thinking about in terms of what needs we'll have to answer and be accountable for 3 to 5 years from now. And I am honored to have a chance to introduce you to our panelists, who I think are going to be tremendous contributors to our discussion. I want to begin by just reminding you that we'll be engaging and hearing from this group of panelists. We also want to be sure that you have the opportunity to be actively engaged in the conversation. So feel free to include comments or questions in the chat or the Q&A function, and we have team members who are monitoring that, and will bring those to the panelists and to myself throughout this closing session. So let me begin by introducing our panel. First of all, I want to introduce Dr. Mary M. Bourque, who is the former superintendent of the Chelsea Public Schools. Dr. Bourque retired from Chelsea in January 2020 and currently serves as Director of Government Affairs for the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. As a coach for new superintendents, and lucky for us, she's also a part-time faculty member here at Boston University Wheelock College. Welcome, Mary. Secondly, Amanda Fernandez is a social entrepreneur and CEO and founder of Latinos for Education, the first Latino founded and led national organization solely dedicated to creating leadership pathways for emerging Latino leaders in education, as well as diversifying education nonprofit boards. Amanda began working on issues of educational opportunity and representation, serving as the Vice President of Latino and External Engagement at Teach for America and a director at the Bridgespan Group, supporting clients on organization and talent development. Amanda, thank you for joining us. As Massachusetts Secretary of Education, James Peyser directs the Executive Office of Education, which oversees early education, K-12, and higher education here in the Commonwealth. Secretary Peyser sits on each of the boards governing the Commonwealth's education agencies, as well as the University of Massachusetts system. He is Governor Baker's top advisor on education and helped shape the Commonwealth's education reform agenda. Before serving as secretary, he was the managing director at New Schools Venture Fund. He supported innovative education entrepreneurs in urban communities to transform public education. Secretary Peyser was Massachusetts Board of Education's chairman from 1999 to 2006. Secretary Peyser, thanks for joining us. And Takeru Nagayoshi, sometimes referred to as TK, if I will slip into that perhaps, because I've gotten to know TK over the years. He is the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year, Professional Learning Director on Community Events at Panorama Education, and a former high school AP English and research teacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts. As an education advocate, Takeru has focused on policy around diversifying our schools and supporting leadership opportunities for teachers of color. He has written op-eds on culturally responsive work, helped recruit educators of color through the Massachusetts Department of Education, and he serves on several state committees, task forces, and advisory boards to fight for equitable and anti-racist policy recommendations. Also proud to say that he is an alum of BU Wheelock College. So just a little bit about format. We're going to spend the next half hour or so with some questions and hopefully engaging conversation amongst our panelists. And then we will stop with lots of time for Q&A from our audience. Also, again, reminding you, you can put questions or comments in the Q&A or the chat box. So let me begin here. Since the disruption of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a general sense that a basic return to normal approach to school would be a missed opportunity to do better for our students coming out of the chaos of the last almost now 2 years. So panelists, imagine it's the fall of 2026, 5 years from now, and you're getting ready to visit a classroom in Fall River, Massachusetts. What do you anticipate seeing, feeling, and learning that you didn't pre-pandemic? So let me perhaps begin with Mary. Okay, I should warn you, Mary may have some linkage issues. She's at a conference site in Hyannis, so we'll come back. Amanda, do you want to take that question?
Sure, thank you, David, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and with everyone on the panel as well as the audience. Thank you for joining us today. So there are so many, I think a myriad of opportunities that we could be thinking about that would make improvements to our future state. A few that stand out for me when I think about, well, what would it look like and feel like going to a Fall River school? I think about, of course, a more diverse educator workforce. I think that's imperative to the Commonwealth that we continue those efforts and don't let up on those efforts. It's been encouraging to see that. I would love to see strong early college and pathways to career for every Fall River High School student. The promise of the early college is something that I hope will continue to be widespread in our schools. I would love to see the work of the department on deeper learning engage students, but along with that, engaged families. I think the pandemic has opened up this opportunity for families to truly be partners with our schools. Whole child, whole teacher approaches, and along with that, seeing the partnerships with community-based organizations that would help strengthen the opportunities for whole child and whole teacher support. And then lastly, for me, it's around technology, and technology truly being an enabler to broaden opportunities for learning, to ensure that our students have digital proficiency. And that's what I'd love to see in Fall River schools 5 years from now.
Terrific. Mary, I think you heard the question, but I want to be sure. And I led off with you, but as we might have predicted, you froze up. So maybe you want to follow up on some of Amanda's comments or add others that you would like to see 5 years from today.
No, I would love it. Basically what I want to see is I want to hear and I want to feel joy, laughter, smiles that start at the mouth and reach the eyes. Individualization of learning with sufficient resources that will include books, but also the use of technology to individualize, reach learners in 24/7 access and equity, civic engagement, partnerships with the business community and internships, bringing learning back into the classroom from the outside world. At the middle, a true belief in using the daily use of growth mindset rather than status mindset, allowing students to own their own learning and providing students to redo assignments to get
Mary, the Hyannis,
better. And also, and basically in a nutshell, building on student assets.
Yeah. Mary, the Hyannis to Boston link is not good. So our events team might be reaching out to you to try to work another option, okay? So Secretary Peyser, Amanda, and Mary have brought up a number of interesting issues that in some ways are policy issues, but I wanna ask you to perhaps address the bigger question, and then I might drill down with a couple of follow-ups. So please.
Yep, well, it's hard to follow up on what Amanda said and what little bit I heard of what Mary said, because they hit a lot of the high points. I think and I'll probably reiterate a couple of them just for emphasis, but I think that's what you've heard is a good list. I guess the thing I'd be, I don't want to be sort of pessimistic about, but want to acknowledge that we're coming out of a period of real challenge educationally, developmentally, from a community perspective, so that students and schools and staff are, and I know this is not necessarily the right word, so I apologize for it. I'm having trouble coming up with a better one, but there's kind of a recovery and a kind of re-engagement and probably acceleration process that's going to need to happen to get us back on track. Not necessarily back on the same track, because the improvements and the reforms or changes that have been mentioned, I think, are all really important and should be pursued aggressively. But we can't believe that we're going to suddenly be back to where we started from, and we can sort of re-engage on all of those dimensions, in the next couple of months or even at the end of the school year. There's going to be a period where we're going to be continuing to try to deal with the impact of what we've just gone through and are continuing to go through. So I would hope that at the end of 3 to 5 years, certainly that we have sort of gotten over that hump, right? And if it says a 5-year recovery, that makes me worried. But 2 to 3 years, I think, is not, unfortunately, unrealistic. And then I think what we need to be doing is doubling down on some things during this time, but especially as we come out of it, that I think are already showing promise of having real impact and moving the needle around, but not just student academic achievement, but also in terms of outcomes, in terms of college readiness, career readiness and success, and a variety of other things that go beyond, grades and test scores and all those other things, but that really demonstrate that we're able to make a difference. Because I think the thing that is, I've been involved in this a long time, David, you've probably been involved in it a lot longer than I have, and Mary as well. It can get discouraging about all of the effort, all of the change, all of the innovation and or reform that gets talked about and gets funded, but doesn't necessarily lead to really different outcomes. And in terms of the equity issues that I think are top of mind for all of us, this has been really hard to make progress. And I think we will discover and are discovering that we've faced a pretty serious setback over the last year and a half. And so all of that is to say, I think and this is where research and data and the folks in the academy can really be helpful. We need to, instead of throwing all of the spaghetti at the wall, we really need to try to identify those things that are having an impact, that are moving the needle, and that we need to really invest in and support in a serious and sustained way. And that may not be the same thing everywhere, right? But we need to be grounding those decisions and those investments and those practices in what is really making a difference for kids. And that's always easier said than done. But I don't want to necessarily presume that I already know the answer to that. I think it's among the things that have just been described, but I think it may be a subset that we really need to focus on.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to TK, who probably is not probably, but is the most recent person to step out of the classroom into his new role. But I suspect many of the experiences you had, TK, over the last 2 years are at the surface of your sense of this question. So
yeah,
please.
I mean, for sure. I want to co-sign everything that's been said so far, right? Diversifying our workforce, investing in early childhood education, making sure that our classrooms are a place of joy. And to Secretary Peyser's point, getting back on track, even if that track looks different. For me, I think the vision would be human connection, community being at the center of our school experiences. And that also means decentering K-12 schools as a primarily academic institution and making them more of a holistic engine for people and community development. And so there's a lot of hoopla, right, over academic learning loss. And I feel like there isn't as much focus, at least in practice, on the social emotional learning loss that's taking place in our school, this loss in our sense of humanity and responsibility to each other. In other words, like not enough focus on the types of awareness and skills that I think can be gained in schools that prioritize community and authentic human connections. As a teacher, one of my favorite mantras to come out of the pandemic was people first, scholars second, right? When referencing our relationship to students as educators, people first, scholars second. And so when I was looking through some of the research that Wheelock College had produced by Jones and his colleagues about teachers, right? And how they use their time during the pandemic, what stood out to me in their findings was this irony in how a lot of teachers were being asked to spend time less with their kids and more times on meetings, on planning, on grading, on assessments, in a time when our kids need present and attentive adults in their lives more than ever. And likewise, on the flip side, and I can attest to my own pandemic era teaching experience as well, what teachers reported in those research was the highest level of a positive affect that they felt was when they were engaging with students, right? And so for me, what was lost as a teacher these past 18 months was that sense of joy that was grounded in a community and authentic human connections. And so in 5 years, I want to see a classroom, I want to hear a classroom and student experiences that restores that reason that drew me into the profession in the first place.
Can I circle back to all of you? And Mary, when you get a chance, you can jump in. I understand we've remedied some of the connection problems, but what would we have to give up to achieve what you all just described? Because in the past 20 years, we've seen in many cases a narrowing of the curriculum to be increasingly academic and standardized. That might be one thing we would have to talk about, especially if we're going to try to address the needs and desires of students in terms of their own career plans. But what else would we have to give up to achieve what you all just described? And I'd let anyone jump in here with that. In the change of the 5 years, what might we not see 5 years from now?
Well, Dave, I'll just jump in.
Thanks, Jim.
Only because I'm just trying to be a good panelist here, not because I have the answer, but to give people more time to think so that the right answer can come out. I mean, I would get back to sort of what I was saying before, which I don't think we know what those vital few things are that we really need to do, which may then cause us to have to make some choices, in some cases hard choices about what to give up or what to do less of. But you know, just as an example, right now, there's a lot of money out there, but in particular, a lot of federal money, but also an increasing amount of state money through the Student Opportunity Act. And we don't have a good handle on how those funds are being allocated and invested at the local level. And one of the things I think we need to start understanding sooner rather than later is what, not only what those plans are, but how those funds are being allocated, because that's going to be the leading indicator of what the choices are that people are making. And the choices they make at the beginning are going to narrow the choices they can make later on. And so not to say that the window is closed, but it's closing pretty rapidly to your point about trying to identify those things that really matter and that really can make a difference for kids, and how we allocate our resources accordingly. So I think there's a real need to, as quickly as possible, and I'm sure Mary and the folks in the Superintendents Association are starting to get a good handle on this, and the department is starting to get some information as well, but to really capture what's going on, to try to understand it so that we can learn from each other across communities, and that we can start reaching out to researchers and other folks in the field to help us make those decisions in a smart way, so that we aren't foreclosing choices down the road that would otherwise be the, perhaps the thing that would be more impactful.
Mary, Jim has teed you up.
Nice.
Yeah,
no, and I appreciate it. So I think if I can jump in, I think I'm not sure the framing of what we should give up is the way to look at this, but more of what do we prioritize now compared to 5 years from now, because the continuum will be different, it will shift, and we'll be able to take on different things, more things as we proceed through the next few years. Perfect example at the conference this morning, one of the superintendents shared that for the first 6 weeks of school in the elementary grades, her school district really prioritized with the younger kids circle time in the morning. And so they doubled the amount of circle time where kids were sitting on the rug and discussing what was bothering them. You know, just investment in that social emotional relationship building. You know, a year from now, you're not going to have to double that time. You can scale that back. And so I do think that it's more about looking at this as a continuum to get to that place 5 years down the road where we're going to see the joy and the smiles and, you know, the full engagement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. Amanda, you led off the last question by talking about a number of changes, including providing students more options of their careers, using technology to more personalize options for students. Many of those things have not always been the priority of the past, where we've had as large classrooms as we could create for the number of teachers or teaching assistants we've provided. So what would change dramatically in order to achieve those ideas you were suggesting?
Well, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to what's happening outside of the school building and what's happening just in society. And really paying attention to the pace at which technology is changing the way we work, the way the pandemic has impacted the way we work. We all have a different background today on our calls than we normally would. And also with just the shifts in the acceleration of the impact of technology, AI, other technologies that I don't have a great familiarity with, but they're coming. And so to me, it's, and at a very fast pace. So for me, I think about, well, it's also not about sort of what do we leave behind, but how do we need to become sort of more flexible and learning and changing the way we do the work of and the opportunity of educating and engaging our students to align with the fast pace in which things are happening in society. It's not just with technology, it's with the diversity of our country. As we begin to become a majority people of color country, and what are the implications of that, and what does it mean for how our kids need to learn how to work together, be together, and work toward a better society together. So I would hope to see that we can allow the kind of flexibility for educators to be able to adapt and change with the times. And that's what I would love to see moving forward when we think about digital proficiency and some of the other opportunities I talked about relative to pathways and early college.
Perfect. TK, I want to make sure you get a chance to respond to this one, and then I have a bigger question to ask you about as well. So what would we—
Thank you.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to remind you, we're saying what would we have to give up or prioritize, as Mary's describing it, in order to achieve some of the things you were describing?
Yeah, I don't have as much of an informed insight on this question, but if there's a takeaway, I think that policymakers and even researchers, right, when they're drawing implications for their research studies can think of, is that sometimes adding more, right, is not the solution. I think as people, we have this sort of addition bias, right? We're cognitively wired to think that if there's more funding, if there's more time, if there's more resources and programming and services given, then our issues would be better. But sometimes, and I could attest to this as my experience in the classroom, all we need is less. Less time to grade, fewer students in our classroom so that we can give more individualized attention to each person, right? Sometimes the magic solution, right, and the creative workaround, even though it might not be politically expedient, is to take something away than to add and pile on. And so that's just a general insight that I think is important for us to be reminded of, that sometimes more is less.
Oh, David, just to
Please.
for a sec, I think one thing I would emphasize as a priority, both in terms of trying to respond to the last essentially, close to 2 years that we've been going through, but also an ongoing challenge that I think is one of the underlying problems that we have yet to resolve, is making sure that we are really taking seriously the need for all students to read proficiently by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade. And I think we have not made that a priority. I think we continue to have, half our students who are not meeting that standard. We're not putting the kind of energy we need to, both on the early education side as well as on the K3 side, K2 probably in particular, to getting students ready to read, to building their vocabulary, to building their skills in a way that is evidence-based and informed by a growing body of research. Because I feel that if we don't do that, a lot of the other things we're talking about here won't really matter in the end in terms of ultimate student outcomes and success.
Well, that's music to my ears, Jim. So that's good to hear. But but I want to perhaps expand on that a little bit. And what else are the essentials? And TK, maybe I'll come back to you on this one and ask you, what are we not talking about? What are the things that, Secretary Peyser raises the issue of early literacy development and how this is a perennial challenge for the Commonwealth. But what else is missing in these discussions?
Yeah, literacy for sure. I hated this idea that as an English teacher, I was the one who was responsible for my students' literacy, when literacy can be thought of and spliced up and conceptualized in so many different domains. I think all of our teachers are reading and writing and literacy experts, or should be in theory. And so I want that ownership to exist alongside everything. I feel like for me though, the main issue I want to talk about is teacher burnout and the mental health challenges that educators are facing right now. Teachers are not okay. And that has so many implications on how well our students perform in school, both academically and social emotionally, our ability to recruit and retain talented, passionate people in the profession. And it also contributes to this ever expanding national educator shortage crisis that we have, right? Last month, I visited the White House with the 2020 and the 2021 State Teachers of the Year. And we met with the Bidens. It was an amazing ceremony. But I was shocked to discover that about a third of our cohort, myself included, has left the classroom. And even more were contemplating on leaving the classroom. And these are the most dedicated and passionate teachers in the country, certainly among the best educators I've met. But they're also educators who have felt that in one way or the other, that the increasing costs, right, not just financial, but the increasing costs of being a teacher is not worth the pay. It's not worth the stress and workload. It's not worth the sacrifice to family time. It's not worth the mental and physical health risks associated with the job in 2021. And so something is definitely amiss. And pandemic era teachers have been asked to go above and beyond. And all of those demands and expectations have risen, oftentimes without this proportionate increase in the respect and dignity that should be afforded to our teachers. Our children, when you think about who they spend their time with, half of their waking hours in a day is with teachers. And so the bottom line is a happy, healthy teacher is a happy, healthy, and therefore academically thriving child. And so we have to pay more attention on how to make the teaching profession more sustainable and worthwhile, right? I also have another gripe actually related to this issue. It's about how our system historically addressed or addresses teacher burnout and mental health challenges. It's always about self-care, right? Do mindfulness exercises, eat a chocolate chip cookie for Teacher Appreciation Day, do something nice for yourself as self-care. But here's the thing, if every teacher needed self-care all the time, it's no longer a self issue, it's a systems issue. And no amount of free coffee mugs or, swag is going to remedy the breaking point that a lot of educators are finding themselves in, right? And by the way, this is true for all school staff. And so whether you're a school leader, a paraprofessional, a custodian, a transportation personnel, educators are constantly under an immense pressure and scrutiny, and we need to do better.
Mary, it seems like TK is raising what we all know is an enormous problem. And this was a challenge pre-pandemic, but now has been amplified, I think, as a result of the pandemic, because teachers and other education professionals and school personnel have been asked to do so much in this time. I'm wondering how the superintendents are thinking about this, either you in your own experience or the state superintendents you're working with now. And certainly they—
I just been booted off of the audio, so.
You didn't hear my question. So maybe I'll shift Amanda while Mary's getting her link back to you, because I know your organization is working hard to try to increase the number of teachers of color, in particular Latino teachers, who enter the classroom. Why would you be doing that? I mean, I understand the rationale for why we want more Latino teachers, but given what TK is saying to us, is it defensible to try to attract people to the field? And if so, what should we be doing to support them differently? And then, what kinds of research might we be doing to help address the concerns that TK is raising around teacher recruitment and teacher retention?
Well, certainly what TK is saying is not a strong endorsement for attracting more Latino and other educators of color to the profession. And so that is a serious challenge. And at the same time, educators of color, and in our case, in the work that we do, we believe that Latino educators are essential to strengthening and improving opportunities for Latino children and other children that they educate. And so, there's no easy answer to it, but we know that this is a systems level challenge as well, that not only just the worries we should have about teacher of color retention, because we know that educators of color leave the teaching force at higher rates. And for Latino teachers, it's around year 4 where you see much more and bigger rates of attrition. So that's something on the retention side to think about. But when you also want to attract college students or high school students to the profession, there's also those barriers of their own experiences that can also be limiting in their attraction to the profession. So it's not a 1 or 2, 3 things that you can do. It's having to step back and look at the system in general across the educator pipeline to address some of the challenges that TK has talked about when you're in the profession. But even before that, it's the experience of young people of color in their education that is going to either propel them to want to be in the profession or repel them in wanting to go into the profession. So it's a really challenging answer, but it's one that we're taking a look at to say it's not just one thing in the pipeline to address. We actually have to look at all the leaks. We actually have to look at all the challenges in order to start changing the face of who our educators are, retaining them and advancing them.
David, I guess the thing I'd say that maybe a little bit either complementary or slightly different than that is, I think the idea that teachers want to go to work in a public education system, like a state system or a district system, and that's somehow you change the variables at that level and that's what makes their work more rewarding. I just don't really buy that. I really think it's at a school level. And I think it means that we need to figure out how to invest our schools with more authority for decision-making, with more control over their environment, including staffing decisions and a variety of things that can make your day-to-day work and your day-to-day work environment and culture more welcoming, supportive, and ultimately effective for your own teaching and student outcomes. And I just feel as long as we're talking about this at a system level, which ultimately is kind of a bureaucratic entity as opposed to an organization that you can actually feel some attachment to, I think we're going to fall short. So I think there's something about figuring out how to enable schools to create those kinds of cultures and support systems. And obviously they need the resources and the tools to do that, but to empower them to create those kinds of environments where teachers want to work and want to stay.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I do believe that our schools are closest, and that's where our teachers spend their day. So I do think it has to happen at different levels, and I think it's complementary for sure.
I want to let Mary jump in here. Welcome back.
Yeah. it's been a trip. But anyway, now we definitely know what our teachers have gone through all the 20 months, right? So absolutely, I think it's on all levels. I think Jim is right. I think Amanda is right. I think it is a systemic problem, but it also goes down into the individual, school level problem. We have to make our profession attractive at a systemic level, absolutely. And each of us have a moral responsibility to bring it back to a place where each of us uses our bully pulpit to talk about the reputation of teachers, to talk about the fact that teachers are heroes throughout this pandemic, that they are the servant leaders of the past, the present, and the future, and that they do have such an impact on our nation and the next generation. So there's a place here. Yes, we need the structures, we need the systemic piece, we need to be building more and more support for our teachers in the classroom, especially during this time when students are returning with trauma, with social emotional needs, and some even going into the clinical mental health needs. But at the same time, each and every one of us in society needs to actually start elevating the position of the teacher in what we say, what we do, and what we profess.
TK, do you agree with that? There are things I like about Mary's comment, but I'm curious if that feels right to you, what she's saying.
Yeah, I think what resonates is this idea that all levels are important, right? Like, sure, school level leadership and what they do in terms of creating incentive structures to attract a diverse, working force matters. But where do you think our school and district level leadership looks to, right? During the pandemic, I was on the reopening school committee, and part of why our district was hesitant to make a commitment to what the next steps look like was because we were waiting on the Massachusetts Department of Education and their guidance, right? And so it's definitely like a both and situation. And so that's super important. I also think of it through like a generational lens. And increasingly, right, our millennials, our Gen Z employees and workers care more about whether or not their workplace values their well-being more than any other generation. And so if we want to invest in creating the future of the education workforce, we have to be attentive to what those values are and make sure that our working conditions are ideal, that they're sustainable, that they're attentive to our needs.
Does that, and I'm going to go back to you, Mary, does that, what TK just said about millennials and Gen Z, does that detract from the heroic teacher idea? Because I think a lot of heroism in teaching was sort of beating the odds, right? Like you're there every day working hard in the worst of conditions, or perhaps not the best of conditions. But is that practical, given that we're struggling to bring people to the field and keep them there?
Well, you'd be asking an end of the baby boomer generation to comment on the other generations. And I don't know if that would be something I would really want to do. I think what it is I think it's most certainly a case of, the younger educators want to feel valued. And why not? Even, baby boomers wanted to feel valued in a certain way. At the same time, their generation has so many more obstacles and burdens placed upon them. The cost of college education and paying back college loans, and then wanting to start a family. My generation, we could teach and have a salary that would support a family. You can't teach, you can't support a family on a teacher's income, let alone pay back your college loans now. So I do, and you're talking to the mother of a high school algebra teacher, and I see the struggle she has with her 2 children. So absolutely, I would say that there's nothing wrong with each generation defining their needs in the workplace for themselves. And if those are the needs, then just like we meet the individual needs of students, we need to meet the individual needs of our educators.
That's good. Jim, I want to turn to you and ask you about the funding issue you mentioned earlier, the amount of dollars that are going into school districts. You already sort of mentioned you're not exactly sure where those dollars are being allocated at this stage or planned to be allocated. But I wonder if there are any trends you're seeing, anything you're concerned about in terms of those trends, how, if people talk to you about where they're thinking about placing those investments, what kind of guidance you're providing to them? I think you've muted yourself somehow, Jim.
Sorry. There may be a couple of levels to respond to this. On the one hand, we have provided sort of guidance and recommendations, not at a not of a sort of a narrow set of programs or strategies that should be implemented, but a short list, if you will, that we are encouraging districts to invest in and to apply, both with their own resources and with state resources, in order to primarily, I would say, accelerate learning, provide extra help. Again, it's sort of more in the near term. How do we respond now to challenges that students have coming back into school, both learning, developmentally, and otherwise? I think there's an assumption that staffing changes and or sort of additions, perhaps more around the behavioral health and mental health side, but sort of more broadly, how the resources can be used for that, especially because they're at this point they're really multi-year resources as opposed to just short term. But the challenges we're running into, as I'm sure Mary can attest, is the workforce shortages are such that it's even with significant boosts for bonuses or salary increases, it's hard to attract people into a variety of fields. One in particular, I would say, is in the area of special education, and in the most sort of severe cases, in cases where students are in residential schools, where the ability to find and hire and retain both skilled staff as well as direct or frontline workers and direct service providers is really, really difficult. I mean, everyone's been reading about bus drivers, right? So this cuts across the entire spectrum. And so my sense is at this point, without having the data that I'd certainly like to have, is that there has been some investment in things like summer school or tutoring or after school programs or some sort of supplemental instructional strategies. There's been an attempt to fund or to pay for or to find more people to come into the schools in order to provide supports across a range of functions. And at the same time, I think there has been a little bit of caution, I would say, about not spending all the money up front and finding themselves in a year or two with budget deficits where they've kind of set themselves up, if you will, for sort of an expense or cost structure that they can't sustain. And that level of conservatism, although on the one hand, I appreciate it, from a fiscal management point of view, it does make me a little nervous that we may not be acting in as urgent a way as possible in order to get kids the support they need now when they need it most.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if other panelists want to respond to Jim's comments. I'm curious about your thinking about the short-term support for students to catch up. Because I think, like the Secretary said, there is this feeling that students have fallen behind, which there's connotations behind that, right? That there's a certain benchmark everybody has to make. This goes back to our perhaps narrowing of the curriculum discussion that I brought up earlier. But I'm wondering if Mary or Amanda, or TK, you have thoughts about whether investments in those areas are short-sighted. I'm not trying to incite an argument here. I'm wondering, how we think about particularly research questions that relate to this down the road. So anyone want to jump in? Mary?
I'll if that's okay. I agree with much of what Secretary Peyser has mentioned. I also see school districts investing in a lot of social workers, a lot of group support from the medical field for the trauma. If you can't hire a social worker, then what they've been looking at is, partnering with, whether it's MGH or Beth Israel Clinic, and bringing in social workers that can run groups. Certainly there's a tiered process where students might need a one-on-one versus a group versus some type of clinical setting. Guidance counselors for this, as well as many of the districts are hiring more and more parent liaisons, because the outreach to the parents is a place where, if we're going to, regulate our students, stabilize them as they come back, as they re-engage with their education, we need to also be wrapping around our families and our parents. And so that piece has been very important. And in particular, in many of the districts, bilingual outreach workers, so that we're reaching our parents in their language. And I don't think that that's short-sighted. I think that's long-sighted, because we need, first and foremost, it's the health and safety of our students, the social, emotional, foundational wraparound services that we have to address before a student is going to be able to sit down and do their phonics or read a history book or anything else. And so these things, as we progress through these first few critical months of the return, is into the first couple of years, are critical investments. Will we see less of a need moving forward? Time will tell. We go back to David, your first question about 2026. What's a year before, in 2025? Are we going to need everything that we've ramped up now in 2025? I don't know. I hope not. I hope that our social, emotional, and our services to our students can get to a point where it's just that normal wraparound for comfort. But yes, I do think that our superintendents and our districts are doing a really good job of strategically looking at where do they spend this money to ramp up, and keep in mind that whatever they put in as a transformational program or structure has to be sustained long term, and have they done the planning for that? And that's been the mantra that we have been saying to them over and over.
It's interesting, Mary, what you're suggesting is may really change the face of what schools look like and who's in them working with children, right? Social workers, use of other types of staff. And I'm wondering, Amanda, whether or not your organization is thinking about ways in which these new types of staff positions working in schools in light of the pandemic, may be opportunities to bring more individuals of color into education. And ultimately, as we rethink the way schools are staffed, we may also be able to diversify staffing that way. Have you thought about that at all?
That's a great point. And we have not gone into sort of any research or sort of deep questioning of sort of how do we broaden the pipeline and redefine what educator pipeline is, right? To be more inclusive, like you're mentioning. So I would just say thanks for bringing that point forward, because I think it's very relevant. I think where we've been putting more attention on is with paraprofessionals, and opening up the pipeline that way. I think in the previous group that was part of this conference was talking about, we had the emergency license, and we had this opportunity that increased the percentage of educators of color who were able to teach during the time of the pandemic. And so we've been looking more at that as a sort of those ways that sort of maybe are silver lining, if you will, of the pandemic. I don't want to say too much is a silver lining of it, but these are the things that we are looking at. But I think you raise an excellent point around broadening that definition, and that could be a lever for the changes that need to happen in our schools to better reflect our communities.
An interesting idea.
It is.
I want to shift a moment to talk about the broader topic of equity that has been raised both by, I think, the racial reckoning we're experiencing and the punctuation that has put on the public schools have not done for communities of color and families that live in communities of poverty, and how potentially this catch-up idea might impact disproportionately, perhaps negatively, those communities. And TK, I want to start with you and see what your thoughts are about that, but then wrap back to each of you about the issue of equitable opportunities and equitable outcomes for students. TK, you want to get started?
Thank you for that question. I worked at a Title I district, right? The type of district where there's a larger share of students who are likely to fit under that category of learning loss, right? And needing to catch up. And so because of that, I get a bit antsy when there's this overemphasis on academic work. Because as a teacher, I remember how much it monopolized my bandwidth when there were so many other additional needs that I had to be focusing on. And especially when you look at things about how race and socioeconomic status are correlated with academic achievement, right? There's a lot of data on how it's less about classroom instruction and teacher effectiveness that matters, but more about the home circumstances of the child. And so I do want to say, when it comes to this catch-up discourse, this learning loss discourse, similar to what my other panelists have said, we have to be careful so that we're not, so that we understand, right, that oftentimes these discussions are couched in data that are better reflections of privilege, not proficiency. That said, it's still important, right, that we talk about catching up and making sure that our kids are learning at grade level standards. I just think, to Secretary Peyser's point, it's going to look different, right, depending on your district, depending on your population. So you have to move beyond this one size fits all model.
Yeah, we've not been very good.
Dave, I could just interject. I mean, I think the thing I just worry about in terms of that framing is that we then decide, well, actually, there was no impact, no academic impact of the pandemic, that we don't need to help students move up the learning curve and get back on track to a place where they can be successful. Because the reality is that, and as much as people, have concerns and complaints about MCAS and standardized assessments, the data, in particular, some data that we've been seeing over the course of the last couple of years have indicated a high correlation between MCAS, even with respect across demographic groups, and ultimate outcomes in terms of college attendance, college completion, and earnings. And again, all of that is also, there are endogenous factors related to socioeconomic status as well. So I don't mean to simplify it or oversimplify it here, but I do think it matters. And it does matter. It matters for students to be able to master academic content, at the appropriate grade levels as they're moving through, so that as they get towards the end of this process, they are in a position to actually be successful from a college point of view, from a career point of view. And again, so I don't want to dismiss what TK just said, but I also don't want us to dismiss those students, if you will, as not being a group that we should be concerned about. And that's not just across racial and ethnic lines. It's sort of across communities more broadly than that as a result of the pandemic.
So I'm mindful that we're coming to the end of our conversation. I haven't seen any questions in the chat or the Q&A that I've seen a lot of great commentary, which I would encourage the panelists to take a look at. But I want to go back to the purpose of the session, which was to help our researchers think about what kind of evidence and data and research we need to help education professionals make the best decisions they're making in what you all have pointed out are uncertain times and potentially high-risk decisions when we don't know exactly what the future holds. So I wonder if each of you could maybe talk about any either specific instances or generalized instances you would hope that we should have better information for shaping decisions, and what kind of evidence you would like to see us bring to some of these in either investment decisions or teacher pipeline decisions, many of the things you talked about today. Anyone want to take a shot at that? What haven't we asked?
I can start.
Great.
The pandemic helped separate the leaders from the managers, the leaders from the administrators. like same role, but vastly different, I think, in impact. And at least for me, the main distinction, as far as I'm aware of how my work was impacted as a teacher, is that a leader tends to have a vision, a set of values that's grounded their action and communication. And that's super important, especially in the context of the pandemic, because it serves as that guiding North Star, so to speak, when you're navigating uncertainty in one unprecedented event after the next. And what I feel we saw were a lot of administrators and managers, those who defaulted to the status quo or were bent, or those who were bent on recreating old systems in the new normal, those whose decisions were perhaps more motivated by fear of criticism than an articulated vision for teaching and learning and what it ought to be. And so if we had more leaders, and I had plenty of great leaders, I don't think teachers would have struggled as much on issues like whether our teaching and learning should center relationships and connection or mostly academics, what the balance and boundary should look like in a new normal where we can be accessed anywhere, anytime, what it means to unpack race, identity, and politics in the classroom and with our colleagues, right? Because I think bereft of that vision or leadership stances on those issues, we saw the whole gamut of practices and mindsets, and some were more harmful than others. I'm not really sure if that really answers the question, but I am certain that when we're navigating spaces where we don't have that evidence, where we don't have that data or research, it helps to have a visionary person in charge.
No, I think it's very useful. Mary?
Yeah, I think for me, I don't want to leave this time frame and not have some type of research that really looks at our educator workforce. There are stories out there. I mean, we can do the qualitative, we can do the numbers in terms of the data and the research, but we really need to start documenting the stories of what happened before, during, and even after, and take from that, what are the best practices? What are the weaknesses in the profession that we can backfill and we can correct and we can strengthen? Ultimately, for me, it's the research right now needs to examine what has been, what is, and what will be, because that's what it will inform, what will be.
Amanda?
Yeah, wow, just to tack on a bit here, but to name one more thing, I think this question of what are the emerging new sets of competencies or evolved set of competencies that education leaders need, as sort of looking at the pandemic as learning, and how do the competencies of school leaders need to evolve, given that nothing is going back to be the same, as has been mentioned. But one thing that's been on my mind is, while we've talked a lot about mental health and the impact on mental health of our students, when I think about some of the decisions that were made over the course of the pandemic, I would just like to learn more around mental health and really how the pandemic impacted mental health and unpacking that, because we're kind of making broad brush statements that the pandemic has caused mental health. Well, yes, it has, but in what ways did that manifest itself? And I'd love to understand that more so that we can make better correlations to how we need to address mental health moving forward.
Thank you, Amanda. Jim?
Yeah, so I would underline, I think, TK's comments around the workforce. I think coming out of this, obviously the workforce has been stressed tremendously, and it's going to look different, even though some of the people may be different and some of the people who are still there may be different. But I think a deeper dive on what the workforce looks like now and what they're, kind of what they're thinking and what their challenges are, and just sort of trying to figure out how we develop human capital and talent strategies that reflect I don't want to say the new, but the transformed or the changed workforce that we now have. And that obviously will be changing in real time as we go forward. And then the other thing, I've mentioned this before, and this is maybe less in the sort of research category per se as information gathering. I think resource allocation and practices around accelerated learning and other strategies. I think we just need to have a better, more comprehensive sense of what's actually going on. And we may not be able to, in the time frame we've got here, say, oh, that's what we ought to all be doing, or that works and that doesn't. But at a minimum, trying to understand what is actually going on, and whatever data we can gather around its impact would be helpful so that we're not just sort of essentially in the dark or operating by the seat of our pants, which is a lot of what's going on. Again, I would say, getting back to some of the things that Amanda said at the outset, there are some things that we've been doing as a state, and obviously in partnership with the schools and districts, around things like early college and early career pathways and a variety of other initiatives that, in order for us to maintain momentum, we kind of need to understand how we came out of this period. Like, did we continue to make progress? Did we get set back? Do we need to reset? So there's some specific programmatic or I don't know, initiative-based research and data collection I think would be really helpful as well.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time together. I think we've raised a lot of important issues, some upon which we agree, and some I think where we may have differences of opinion, which may be contextual, maybe also related to our own experiences. But I want to thank the panelists, Mary Bourque, Amanda Fernandez, Takeru Nagayoshi, and Secretary Jim Peyser for joining us today and for your generosity of your time and your good thinking. I also want to remind the audience that a lot of research that has been done in the last couple of years has been unable to reach all populations because getting data has not been as easy as it once was pre-pandemic. So stay tuned. I think a lot of more data will be collected around vulnerable populations, for example, in ways that protect their privacy, et cetera. I want you to be on the lookout for post-event follow-up emails from WEPIC. They're also preparing, the WEPIC team is preparing a summary of the themes of today's discussions, and with the goal of providing some contours for research and analysis work that might meaningfully contribute to many of the questions that have been raised and the vision setting for the future. If you haven't already, as Dean of the college, if you haven't already connected to BU Wheelock or WEPIC communities, we'd certainly invite you to sign up for mailing lists or follow us on social media. Easy links to do either of these things will be included in our post-event email. So once again, thank you all for being part of our discussion, and thank you to the WEPIC team, particularly Megan Combe, for assembling this terrific day for us. And we look forward to the future. Take care.
Thank you, David.